Snow fell soundless in the god's wood, every flake a soft blade that sank into bark and branch and fur. The heart tree watched without blinking, its pale face weeping sap that had darkened to rust where it touched the grooves of its carved eyes. Ghost stood beside the pool with a stillness that made him seem another growth of winter rather than a living thing. Only his breath betrayed him, white plumes rising, fading, rising again. Jon rested his palm against the blood-red trunk and felt its chill through the leather. He did not pray aloud. The gods heard truths more easily when a man spoke them into his own bones first. Bran's sledge creaked behind him over the crust of ice. Mira had learned the tree-worn paths before the rest of Winterfell did. She guided the sledge to the edge of the water and stepped back without a word. The boy, no, not boy, not anymore, turned his face toward the heart tree, and the weeping eyes seemed to lower toward him in answer. The snow took the sound out of the air, and it was as if they were alone at the bottom of some deep white sea. "You came," Jon said, "because sometimes the plainness of a thing needed saying for it to feel true." Bran looked past him into the ripples that the falling snow traced over the pool. "I am here," he answered, "but I am also where the water goes when it seeps into the roots. I am in the ravens that circle above the lake to the east. I am on the wall and beyond it. I am what looks back when the heart trees dream." Jon let out his breath and set his shoulders, as if to brace more weight upon them. "You're Bran Stark, my brother." The corner of Bran's mouth lifted briefly. It might have been a smile or the memory of one. "I am Brandon as our father named me," he said, voice low and even. "I am the last child who climbed the towers, and I am the place he fell from. I am the boy who died and did not. I am the one the crows chose." "Then you know why I asked you here." "I knew before you asked." Bran's gaze moved from the water to the white wolf, then to Jon again. "You will put a crown on my head." Jon looked at the blade of Longclaw where it lay against the root, its bear's head pommel half hidden in snow. "If there's to be a crown," he said, "it must not be the old Southron kind. Not gold. Not a promise to kneel to anyone who sits a chair in King's Landing. The North remembers, Bran. It remembers our own kings and the cost of forgetting them." Bran's eyes were not cold. They were far away, like stars reflected in black ice. A circlet of bronze and iron, worked in the shape of the dire wolf, he said, almost to himself. "A smith at White Harbor has begun it already. He had the idea while sharpening a plow blade. He will think he dreamed it tonight, and tomorrow he will make it. You will pay him twice what he asks." Jon might have smiled if the heaviness in his chest had been lighter. "You see farther than any king we've had, then." "I see farther than men are meant to, and sometimes less than a child should." Bran's lashes caught flakes and melted them. "You will speak to the lords. They will try to give you back the words they spoke, because names cling like frost, and the name they gave you was king. You will put it from you and give them me. They'll say the boy they remember is gone. They'll say the cold took him and left a hollow thing in his place. Then tell them truth as you do," Bran said. "Say that the boy is gone. Say that what remains sees the storm coming. Say that the crown is a weight that would drown you in the first flood, and that you know a shore to lash it to. That is what a brother does. You speak like you've been king already." Bran's eyes turned to the heart tree again. "Kingship is not what men think. It is not power. It is sight that never shuts. It is knowing how many roofs will collapse when the first thaw comes. It is hearing every hunger at once and choosing which is most likely to kill the mouths that speak it." His gaze returned to Jon, and for an instant something like boyish worry trembled behind it. "And it is not something I can carry alone." "No," Jon said. Ghost lifted his head. Jon slid his hand along the wolf's neck and felt tangled ice in the fur. "It never should be." They took the weight of the future into the hall like a drifted storm. The lords of the north and the men of the Vale packed the benches and filled the air with wool and damp and the dry bitterness of smoke. The banners of Mormont and Manderley, Glover and Serwyn, Reed and Hornwood and Tallheart hung heavy. Robert Glover's jaw was set. Lord Wyman's belly was a hill beneath his sable. Little Lyanna Mormont sat with both hands on a pommel taller than her, eyes like points of iron. Among the faces were new ones, pale with the relief of surviving Ramsay Bolton's winter, and older ones marked by the kind of grief that had not had time to become a scar. Jon stood at the dais below the carved direwolves and looked at them. He saw the stubborn pride that had refused the Lannisters bread even when their purses were empty, the anger that had marched on Winterfell with fewer men than a lord should risk, the loyalty that had held the torn map of the North together when Littlefinger's lies were pressing at every seam. He saw hunger. He saw fear. He did not see a desire for ceremony. "You called me king," he began. The hall quieted first at the sound of his voice and then at the gentleness of it. "You did so after I led you into a battle we won by luck and the grace of a giant. You did so because you wanted a name that meant you belonged to yourselves again. You wanted a breath you didn't owe to the south." Murmurs ran, soft as wind under a door. Jon raised his hand. "You were right to want that. You are right still. But you were wrong about me." He let the words sit, plain and steady. A king needs to see beyond the length of his sword and the reach of his anger. He needs to see beyond the winter that's on his face to the one that lives under the mountains. He needs to remember what the stones whisper and what the trees have learned from the water. "I cannot see those things." Another silence. Jon felt Sansa's gaze on him, cool and measuring. The sister with a voice of leaves and iron. At his right, Davos stood like a post planted where the land meets the sea. Arya was shadow in the crowd, a scent of leather and oil, a stillness that was not peace. "There is someone who can," Jon said. He lifted his hand, and the hush became so complete that even the fire seemed to bank itself. Mira guided the sledge forward to the foot of the dais. Bran sat, his hands folded on his lap, his face as steady as the stone of the dais beneath Jon's boots. "Brandon Stark," Jon said, and the name cut through the hall like a blade, not because of its sharpness but because of what was being cut loose. "Bran, my brother, the last living son of Eddard Stark of Winterfell. He went north of the wall and returned with more than the wind in his hair. He sees what is coming. He hears the past when it speaks, and he isn't fooled by its lies. He will not be soft with you or cruel to you. He will be true. The North needs a true king." There were shifts of weight. Glover looked as if he would speak and thought better of it. Lord Wyman's pupils shrank to points. Lyanna Mormont leaned forward, coughed a little, and did not bother waiting to be called. "We swore to follow the king in the North," she said, voice honed to an edge by fury and faith. "If the one we shouted for says he is not that king, then I will ask him this. Does he say it because he fears the task or because he knows who is better for it?" Jon met her eyes. "Because I know." He turned, and Sansa's eyebrows lifted, the faintest flicker of surprise blooming and then sealing away again as quickly as warmth closes fingers around a cup. He took from Maester Wolkan the circlet that had been sent up from White Harbor that morning. The bronze and iron worked in the shapes of interlocked direwolves. The metal hammered until it had the dull shine of something lifted from the roots of a mountain. He held it for the hall to see. Then he knelt, and the buzz of voices turned into a single indrawn breath. He set the circlet upon Bran's brow. He should have said something formal. He found that the words that rose in him were too simple to gild. "Rise, Brandon Stark," Jon said, and his voice moved through the hush like a slow river. "King in the North." Bran's eyes closed, and for an instant the air in the hall shifted. Everyone, even those who would later swear they felt nothing, felt the press of a cold wind that had not entered through any door. When he opened them again, the first voice to answer was little Lyanna's. She stood on her bench and lifted her small fist like a new forged mace. "The king in the North!" Her cry took the hall. It rolled out, struck the rafters, tumbled back. Men stood. Men knelt. Men shouted. Sansa stood with them, face composed and bright, and when she turned to Jon her eyes had softened. In the echo of the shouting, Davos leaned to Jon's ear. "You've gone and taken weight off your head." Then, the Onion Knight murmured, "Best place to put it after is on your shoulders. It tends to sit there whether you like it or not." Jon looked at his brother. at the circlet that had settled there as if it had been measured for this very brow long ago. "I didn't think I'd be rid of anything," he said. "I thought I'd put a true name to the burden." "If that's not what a good man does," Davos said, "I've no sense for words." They made a place for the new shape of power and called it the King's Council out of habit and necessity. Sansa took the settling of food and stores as if she had expected it all her life, and the truth was that life had been teaching her whether it meant to or not. She spoke to women who had never given their opinions beyond their own hearths and learned where every barrel of barley was hidden, who had salt left for curing and who had too little to keep fish edible more than 3 days. She learned the names of shepherds who had lost half their flocks and which barns had timber sound enough to be moved. She moved men as if they were pieces on a Sivas board without the delight in game playing. The North was not a board and men were not pieces, and if she forgot that, then she would crack in the first hard freeze. She did not forget. Davos oversaw the ports. White Harbor's belly had always been full and open to ships, and Lord Wyman proved more useful than any man so fond of pies had a right to be. He put rivals at one table and fed them until they had agreed to send their best wood to the shipyards for new hulls and their worst to the kills for arrow shafts. He shook his vast head mournfully over his ledger, as if it were a dirge, and then signed it with a flourish that was nearly a dance. "Skins for the west wind," he told Davos, amused. "Salt and lantern oil for the east. If the dead come from both sides, we'll be lit right enough to see them." The Onion Knight smiled a thin, hard smile and arranged for men to sit in towers with bell and horn. Alice Karstark and little Ned Umber knelt under the dire wolves of Winterfell and swore their houses to the king. Sansa's mouth pressed into a line when Jon told her he meant to keep their lands under their names rather than break them up for loyalty to be rewarded. But she listened to the case he made and then to Bran's quiet interjection. "We cannot afford a grudge to be sown that deep," he said. "We will need houses stubborn enough to have bent the knee to a Bolton to be stubborn enough to keep it kneeling to us." She lifted her hands in assent while her eyes calculated 2 and 3 winters forward. "Very well," she said, "but the first hint of ill faith and I will not have another forgiving word to lay on the table." Arya moved like a wind's shadow through the corridors, through the bailey, along the walls. She appeared beside the guards on the night they traded shifts and said nothing until they learned to keep their backs away from the parapet, because the first enemy was the fall a man didn't see. She dined in the kitchens with the girls and traded the flavors of hot root and sweet onion for rumors that were thinner than gruel but more nourishing where it mattered. She watched Peter Baelish watch Sansa and took note of how his smile tightened and loosened in time with the deepening of Sansa's respect for her brother and the increasing stillness of Bran's eyes. She added his name to the list that lived inside her head like a second spine and waited to see which moment would be the one to break him. Jon did the work that had no name and all names. He rode the new gift and found new free folk villages where children with hair like pale moss sat on their haunches and glared at him until they decided whether he was threat or kin. He sat with Tormund giants baned by a fire that smoked as badly as Tormund cursed and planned how to get spears into the hands of men who liked to hunt more than hold fences. He went to the wall and stood on the ice with Edison Tollett, who had the look of a man whose humor had been boiled without salt, and they spoke of men and stones as if they were both precious and likely to fail in the coming winter. He listened to the sky. He listened to the ravens. He listened to the quiet spot in his chest that had never thawed since he clawed himself back from Black. It was Bran who sent for him one morning when the sky was pale as old bone. The king sat in the solar that had once been their father's. The map was on the table with little stones to mark the places where they had food and larger stones where they had none. Bran did not look at it. He looked past it into a space Jon could not see. "There is a mountain in the sea," Bran said. "On it there is stone that burns cold and kills that which is already dead. There are 3 living creatures there whose bones are fire and whose wings are shadow. There is a woman there with a name that had a crown on it before she was born, and she is looking north without knowing why." Jon set his hand on the back of a chair and curled his fingers into the wood. "Dragons. One of the words for them in Valyria," Bran said, as if reciting something half-remembered from a book he had read as a small boy, meant hunger that never sleeps. He turned his eyes to Jon's hand on the chair, then back up to his brother's face. We will need her hunger to push the dead back. We will need what lies under her castle to arm our men. You will go to her. I serve you, Jon said, not as a sword in a lord's hand, but as the hand itself. If the hand is severed from the body bleeds it out. The North. Sansa will keep Winterfell in ways that do not involve a sword, Bran said mildly. Davos will keep the sea. Arya will keep truth sharp. I will watch. You will bargain for what we need as if your breath depends on it. It does. So does mine. Jon's mouth flattened. If she asks the North to kneel, you will tell her we have already done so, Bran said. And for the first time in a long time a dry humor glimmered in the corner of his eye. To a Stark. Davros laughed when he heard that. If you can make a dragon queen smile with that answer instead of turning us to cinders, Snow, I will buy you the most ridiculous hot pie Lord Wyman can bake. The sea to Dragonstone was an iron road. It smelled of salt and cod and rope, and it moved like a beast men had spent too long pretending to master. The island rose out of the gray churn as if it had crawled up from the deep to sun itself, black stone lunging into the sky and then freezing there. The castle crouched on the back of that stone like a thing grown rather than built. Spines and wings and teeth and windows like slitted eyes. Davos made the sign of a man measuring risk against necessity, then knocked knuckles against the rail and grumbled that even a god of storms had better sense than to pick a fight with what lived here. When they were ushered into the hall, the air was warmer than any place Jon had stood in for months. Torches made the scaled pillars gleam. She sat on the throne cut from dragon skulls and iron and heard their names read in a voice that had been born on a desert and had not yet forgiven the sea. He felt the weight of her gaze before he looked up into it. It was not a young gaze, though she looked young. It was a gaze that had measured shipwrecks and cities from a saddle and learned that people are not more solid than dreams. Jon Snow of Winterfell, Tyrion Lannister said with that sideways smile that had soothed a girl in a red dress once, long ago. And Ser Davos Seaworth, who has survived more kings than most poor fools have had the chance to kneel to. I see that the North has learned to send the right men south when it wants something. We bring more than wanting, Jon said. We bring truth, and we bring need. Daenerys Targaryen rose. She did not descend. They say the North has a king. Her voice was cool. I am queen. The North has a king, Jon said. And he's my brother. He sent me because I am his hand and his voice, and because the thing that matters more than crowns is moving against us from beyond the wall. He told her the rest without flourish. How the dead moved in a tide that did not tire. How their eyes were a color men had no word for until they saw it and never slept again. How fire slowed them and dragonglass shattered them. He spoke, and while he did, Tyrion watched Davos's hands, and Missandei watched Jon's eyes, and Grey Worm watched everything. Daenerys did not take her gaze off Jon. A queen does not share her throne, she said when he finished. But a realm is large enough for more than one crown if both remember there are things larger than their pride. We've had quite enough pride to choke on in the North, Jon said. It's hunger we're talking about now. She studied him as if she meant to separate his shadow from his body, and then with one short nod she stepped down from the throne. You will have the dragonglass, she said. We will mine it. We will shape it. We will carry it north on ships that will not capsize because I will forbid it. A little flare of something like mirth sparked along Tyrion's mouth. I will ask no kneel of your king. I like old stories, and I'd rather be in one of those than write a new one with nothing but ash for ink. But you will show me the dead before I take my armies out of the south. I thought that good sense would be scarce here, Davos muttered under his breath and then added in his normal tone. We can manage that, your grace. They took Jon to the caves where the rock glittered if you looked at it sideways. He saw carvings done with hands that had never held a quill, the shapes of men and children, and something that looked like a great winged beast painted in a pigment that did not fade when the torchlight moved. The story on the stone's face was older than cities. The people who had been there first and the people who came after and the enemies that had made them stand together or die. He traced one finger a hair's breadth above the grooves of a figure that lifted fire to the air and watched small stone men move into its shelter as if the movement had been carved into their nature. "You think she'll come north when she sees a corpse that shouldn't walk?" Davos asked. "I suppose if I were queen of half the world and had 3 things bigger and fiercer than any storm, I'd want a reason to bring them into snow. A damned beautiful one." "Winter is reason enough," Jon said, but his gaze had gone inward while the torch spit and the cave breathed. There had been words in Bran's voice that had folded into themselves like paper. He fey. LT as if he were trying to open them now without tearing them. Hunger that never sleeps. Ravens from Winterfell found them there in the dragon-boned hall. The scratches on the parchment were jagged with cold and haste. Tormund's blunt fist had scrawled a warning that smelled of smoke even through the wax. Beyond Eastwatch, the dead moved as rapidly as a weather change, and the ice sang in a way that made men's teeth ache. Ed added a line with his drier hand. If anyone had meant to see the truth for themselves, now was the time that mattered. "We'll need proof," Jon said. "We cannot afford to bring the entire army south and find the city fighting to keep itself." Tyrion, who had folded his hands and tapped a thoughtful rhythm against his knuckles, lifted his eyebrows. "A rare Northman," he said, "who counts the mouths of strangers before his own." "I'm counting whose stomachs the dead will eat first," Jon returned. "And last." They went with a plan etched hard as ice in Bran's head and then written soft as shadows by Arya's mind. The dead moved at 2 speeds, glacial and storm-quick. They would need a small party to reach for a single proof while larger forces waited to collapse upon failure like a second skin over a wound. The Hound came with eyes that had learned how to look at fire without flinching and a mouth that could not keep itself from honesty. Beric Dondarrion came with his blessed sword, and between the sparks of humor and impatience in his voice there was always the sound of a man counting his remaining deaths like coins. Jorah Mormont came because his oaths twisted around him and pulled him where he needed to go. Gendry came because a hammer belongs in all wars. Davos did not come because a man with a slow blade made to cut rope and a mind made to count did more good on a wall than on a frozen lake. It went wrong because plans do while remaining in their bones, right? They found a patrol of the dead where the ground flinched under their boots like something sleeping. They sprung the trap that Bran had seen. A ring of fire that sparked from oil trickling through fissures in the ice. Beric's blade glad in the light. The Hound bitter, Jorah steady, Gendry swift. They cut their proof loose, a thing that screamed as if a horn had been forced down its throat, and lashed it to a sledge whose wood creaked like an old man's teeth. Then the sound that lives without breathing went up along the ridge, and the white cold of numbers came down. The retreat was all breath and muscle and the particular courage that consists of keeping one foot in front of the other while horror scrapes at your back. The lake did what lakes do. Its skin groaned and then broke. The whites did what dead do. They fell and then rose and then kept coming. They circled on the little island of rock that had heaved up like the knuckle of a hand, cold cutting to the marrow like a knife that had no edge and no point and yet got everywhere. Beric died again and came back with a gasp through teeth that had lost their color. The Hound cursed the air and kept moving as if he meant to set it on fire by hate alone. Jorah's breath stayed calm and clipped as if he were still in a tiled training yard. And then shadow thundered. Fire licked the wind apart. The dragons came down out of the iron sky like pieces of night that had remembered how to burn. Daenerys stood on the back of the largest and shouted in a language that had never been spoken under a roof. Jon saw her not with his eyes but with the part of him that had learned how to see through winter, the way she leaned into the wind as if it were a horse, the way the dragon's neck flexed to look for enemies and then for her before it struck. Rhaegal swept low. Jon's hand closed on the cold ridge of a spine and found that his body had learned something his mind had not: how to climb a dragon without dying. They escaped in heat and broken ice and a snowfall of embers. It would have been neat then. It would have been one of those stories that almost kept their hands clean. The spear that the Night King lifted had been carved from a place where light goes to die. He cast it as if he were throwing away a piece of himself he had never needed. It struck Viserion with a sound like a breath unrolling backward into silence. The dragon fell in a scream that knocked the thoughts out of Jon's head. For an instant he heard a boy in the gods wood telling him that kingship was sight that never shut. For another instant he saw a tower with a woman in it, and then he saw only blue and black and white, and the air went out of his body when he hit the water. He woke on a cold back that breathed like a forge, Regal's ribs working under him like bellows, Daenerys's hair blown into his eyes, the wind hammering through his clothes until it found the place Scar had grown over Scar and chose to live there. The dead had not followed. Not yet. They brought their captive to Eastwatch and set it snarling before men who had stopped speaking except to tell their fingers to move. Gendry ran like a man with a message in his veins. Davos's hand was a knot on Jon's arm. The hound looked at the wall's height and muttered that one day all the tall things in the world would learn what it was to be cut down. The proof did what proof does. It made a story into a door men could walk through. They took the White South in chains and opened it in the Dragon Pit under a sky that had forgotten winter's rules. It tore toward Cersei Lannister with hunger that had nothing to do with flesh. She took one step back and then another, behind the line where fear turns into calculation. And Jon watched her face while Tyrion watched his sister's hands and Daenerys watched the guard that moved when she moved. Cersei agreed to grant a truce that she had no intention of honoring. Jon agreed to honor a truth he had no intention of breaking. Between them they laid a web of words as frail and strong as silk. Inside it, men sharpened their blades and breathed through their noses and said nothing. Bran, who could not walk, went everywhere at once and then at once again. He told Sansa where Littlefinger had hidden every letter that had ever been cut and pasted into a noose. He told her which men had held the knife at their father's throat with their words. He told Arya which corner of which corridor the man would turn into before he was dragged before the Stark and the King and the Winter Stone. Peter Baelish bled fear from his eyes when he realized that knowledge had remade law. Arya's strokes were as clean as always. Sansa watched, and though the line of her mouth was hard as frost, the air around her seemed freer after. The wall fell. It was not a wall falling. It was winter remembering the shape of the sea. Viserion's corpse flew in blue fire and beat its wings over the ruins of a thing so old men had made religions out of not looking too closely at it. Ed Tollett sent the last ravens while the wind snatched at their feathers like a cat. Eastwatch became a word meaning cold too sharp to touch. The dead moved south in a line that bent like a bow toward Winterfell. They did not light 1,000 little torches and send brave fools to die in front of them. They placed the trenches in layers and filled them with oil and old fish and dead brush and women who could aim set their arrows to fire behind parapets instead of in front of them. The Dothraki, who had learned too late what darkness does to courage, were all in a cluster under the castle walls where they could surge and slice and surge again, and every time they came back, a pair of maesters threw water into their mouths and then shouted at them until the color returned to their faces. Unsullied lined the gaps like stitches. The wolves, what was left of them, ran messages through the snow, knowing their names just long enough to get the words to the right ears before the wind took them. Lyanna Mormont stood on a cart and shouted until men 3 times her size heard her and did what they were told. Sansa moved the people whose bones were too light or too brittle to fight into the glass gardens where the damp and the chill could be held at bay by coal stoves and blankets. The crypts were warded by weirwood carvings and circles of salt overnight. The dead in them did not rise. She had learned that trick from an old woman in a village near the Wolfswood who laughed like a crow and died the next morning after giving it. Sansa sent her a priest's prayer, and then the meat that would have fed her that day to a starving man who had a child on each hip. Bran sat in the godswood in a chair carven in the shape of intertwined roots and watched the dead come like a pale tide that never broke. Jon stood with him as long as he could, his hand on Ghost's ruff, feeling the wolf's heart drumming like a drum that wanted to lift the army by its beat. Then he swung into a saddle and lifted Longclaw. "You know what you need to do," Bran said. He sounded as if he were talking to himself and to someone far away and to Jon all at once. "I do," Jon said. "Do not die," Arya told him, and pulled a small blade from somewhere impossible and pressed it into his palm. It was the same blade he had seen in a tower in his mind, the same blade a man had once meant to put through a boy's throat. Valyrian steel. The weight of it in his hand was slight and enormous both. The dead struck. Snow and fire and iron and screaming. Jon learned that he could stand on a dragon whose breath made the night burn and still see the faces of the men below him with the clarity of a man fated to remember each one. He learned that a White Walker's bone shatters differently under Longclaw than under a dragonglass mace. He learned that if you give a man from the gift a spear and a task and his child behind him with a bundle of wool, he will stand longer than a knight who thinks his horse makes him taller than other men. Regal heaved under him as if the air were water. Drogon's shadow slid over the battlefield, and where it passed the whites became brief torches before they collapsed into ash. The sky filled with Viserion's terrible blue, and the gears inside Jon's chest ground in pain. Dragons fought like storms fight, by clashing each other until more light broke than sound. He would have fallen in love with the sky if he hadn't been trying not to die in it. When the Night King came through the snow, men felt him rather than saw him. Sound seemed to become a thing that bent around him. The heads of the dead turned to him as if pulled by ropes. He moved as if he had never learned to hesitate. The White Walkers around him were fewer than Jon had feared and more than he had the right to hope for. Jon guided Regal down with knees and will and dropped from his back into the snow like something that had fallen from a tree long ago and learned to walk. He was on his feet at once. The plan, the kind that is half prepared and half prayed over, closed around the Night King like the hands of a trap. The trenches flared. The Unsullied shifted their ranks with a discipline that would have been beautiful if there had been any beauty left in the night. Arya moved where men did not see her. Theon stood with a dozen of the best archers of the Iron Islands that Winter had not yet taken and sent shafts into the walkers with a precision that made his brother's ghosts nod. The Night King ignored them all. He moved to the Godswood as if he had been born with the map of it under his skin. The snow there lay thin over roots that curled like sleeping serpents. Bran watched him come, eyes pale and far, and the air felt full of wings as all the ravens in the world poured themselves for one instant into the limbs above. The White Walkers formed a ring. Theon stepped forward and broke it for a breath, then another, and then he fell with a smile that did not belong to the boy who had pretended to be a prince all his life. Jon came into the Godswood through a path that had not been there a heartbeat earlier. Perhaps the trees made it. Perhaps Arya did. The Night King turned his head, and for a moment the cold narrowed to a point and touched Jon's heart. Everything else fell away. There was no sound in the world except the small crunch of snow under boot and the slow beat of a heart that had learned to die and beat again. He did not run at the Night King. He walked. When he reached him, he bowed his head as if he were a subject before a king. The Night King lifted his hands as if to take a crown or a neck. Jon leaned forward as if to offer either. The walker's fingers closed. Jon slid, quietly, the dragonglass dagger Arya had pressed into his palm into the precise space under the breastbone where ribs are less closely set, just enough for small hands. There was a sound, and it was the sound of thin ice cracking on a pond. The Night King's head tilted the smallest degree to one side, as if a thought had occurred to him for the first time, and he was as surprised as any man would be to find himself thinking it. He did not shatter then. He did not explode as the walkers did when panicked. His eyes went from the blue of winter to the gray of river stone and then to no color at all. He dropped like a clod of snow falling from a branch. The ring of White Walkers rippled, and the ones inside the ring broke first, then the ones outside, and then the breaking went out like a ripple on a pond after a stone has been thrown into its center. The dead fell. They did not rise again. Silence came in a wave that made the hair on Jon's neck rise. He looked down at the dagger in his hand, and then at Bran, and then at the place where the Night King's body had been. It was already settling into the ground, as if being taken back into the long story he had tried to step out of. Bran's eyes came back from wherever they had gone. "I saw," he said. Jon tried to laugh and found that his chest had learned to do nothing except breathe. Arya walked out of a shadow with blood on her ear and snow in her hair. "So," she said, and the word was as bright as a knife blinked clean. "It turns out you can take advice. I told you not to die," she said after Jon had caught his breath and turned toward her. And there was something like a grin waiting under her words if you knew how to look. "I'm very obedient," he said. For a moment his voice wanted to break. It didn't. The battle did not end where the Night King fell. Battles never do. Men still needed to be told to stop killing things that no longer wanted to kill them. Fires needed to be put out and then kindled in different places. Wounded needed to be carried and covered and warmed and spoken to. There were names to be said and names to be unlearned because the men who bore them could not say them again. There was a dragon to be tended whose wounds smoked in gusts. There was another to be mourned in a way men had not learned how to mourn a thing like that. But the weeping of Winterfell that night was not grief without a shore. It was the sound people make when their bodies remember what hope is and are briefly terrified by it. In the Godswood, beneath the bleeding face of the heart tree, Sansa laid her hand on Bran's shoulder. Arya stood with her palm against the trunk and her forehead against her knuckles. Jon stood a few paces off and watched the breath plume from Ghost's nostrils. He watched it and felt his own chest rise and fall, and for the first time in months there were two heartbeats in the world that mattered to him, his own and the North's. After comes the businessmen do when they are done pretending that victory is a feast. The dead had taken more than men. They had taken roofs and seed and the idea that the year after next would be something a person might want to live for. Sansa moved numbers and people until they fit together snug as hands clasped in sleep. Manderly sent ships and then sent more. The Vale sent grain, and Sansa made sure they understood that the North would remember who had come through winter with them rather than merely watched. Davos stole a pair of oxen from a man who had tried to sell the council the same 2 oxen 3 times, and then he took the money they would have paid for the second pair and used it to buy rope and tar for the ships that would sail south, because they needed to go south again. Cersei Lannister's truce had never been more than a handkerchief over a knife. The Golden Company crossed into the Crownlands with banners that made respectable men feel sick, because there is a particular stench to soldiers whose loyalty carries a price and whose price raises with each corpse they climb. Qyburn learned too quickly how to aim the weapon he had made to bring dragons out of the sky, and then forgot too quickly that the world contains too many winds for a machine to manage them all. Euron Greyjoy stank of fish and fear and blood, sometimes in that order and sometimes not. The council met in Winterfell with the doors closed and the candles low. On one end of the table Bran looked like a boy who had not quite grown into his father's chair, and also like a king who had dreamed all chairs and chosen this one as gently as a hand takes a child's wrist. "We will not rule the South," he said, before anyone else could open the discussion into the fear that always lay under it. "We will not kneel to it either. We will help it free itself to be ruled by the one who can hold it for long enough to make children grow tall again." "Daenerys has armies enough," Tyrion said from the other end of the table. He had come north for this council because something in him had never settled into any place that smelled of heat since they had stood in Dragonstone's caves. What she needs is a plan that doesn't end with the city burned and rebuilt out of rubble that's still warm. "Then the plan begins with what you know," Sansa said, and the slight sardonic tilt of her mouth made her look very, very much like the girl who used to listen to songs and make certain her stitches were even in places where no one would ever see them. "And what we know. Between us, we may make a whole. The Golden Company will look for a field where they can make their numbers mean more than the cities." Jon's voice had roughened since Winterfell. "We must deny them such a field. Strangle their food," Lord Wyman said in his grumbling good humor. "I have strangled appetites in my time and find it no less pleasing in the field than at table." "Not just the Golden Company," Davos said. "Cersei's the one with food enough to last longer than any siege if she decides to eat her people before she runs out of bread. She knows where the wildfire's buried. If we make the city her enemy, she'll use them as kindling. Then we make the city our ally," Jon Royce rumbled. "There's half the realm in King's Landing that didn't choose to be there." "Which is most of the realm," Tyrion said, and a small, bleak smile made a brief home on his mouth. "You cannot choose where you are born, as I should know." They put together a plan that would look to the outsiders like a battle, and to those who had sat under the heart tree like a harvest. They moved ships like weights on a weaver's beater, tightening the lines until the shuttle could go back and forth between the north and the southern ports without snapping. They moved the Dothraki and the Unsullied and the armed men of the Vale and the north as if teaching them a new dance and hoping they would learn the steps before the music stopped. They moved words. Letters went, some with names written on them and some on blank parchment that would fetch more when sold to the right eyes and ears. Arya moved in the spaces between it all and made sure that the letters reached the wrong hands when it was superior that they should.
Danerijsrode.
North, once the dead, had been buried under snow and cairn. She stood in the hall at Winterfell with her hands at her sides and looked at the boys working mended iron in the corner, at the girl who had crossed the floor twice to bring a tray and had managed not to drop it. She looked at the heart carved above the dais and the faces that turned to her and then to their king and did not draw breath to ask why the crown had settled where it had. She looked at Jon as if she were reading a passage in a language that she could not forget but often mispronounced. That night, under the boughs, Jon told her the truth Bran had told him quietly while the dead still walked and there had been no time to make something of it. Whose son he was, and what name the world would have given him if winter hadn't stolen it. She stood for a long while with the snow packing her lashes and the dark pressing close, and at the end of that while she raised a hand and touched his chest where the scars lay like islands. "The world will call you what it wants," she said, and her voice had a crack in it that had not been there when she made men kneel by fire. "You will call yourself what you choose." "I choose what I did when I set the crown on Bran's head," he said. "I could put my name on the throne in the south and spend the rest of my life killing people for it, or I can spend that life keeping these ones alive because I know the shape of their hunger." She looked east, toward a sea she could not see. "Then I will take what's mine by a different route," she said. "I will try to keep it by a different means." And for a time it seemed as if the gods had chosen to grant the tired grace. The march south was a steady, grinding cog of men and horses and carts and grain and iron that gave no one a thing to sing about and gave everyone a little more air to breathe. The Golden Company met the north and the Vale on a plain far enough from King's Landing that men could see the city but could not easily run to it. The battle was one of those that the dead loved to haunt because it did not honor anyone with glory so much as it honored the stubbornness of feet that stayed planted. Jon rode along the flank and made sure the gaps filled with people who still had enough strength in their thighs to hold a line. Rhaegal tore the air above only to drive fear into the company and nothing else. This had been the rule agreed, and Daenerys kept it. The Golden Company broke not because they were cowards, but because their purse strings had never run through their hearts, and because archers who had kept walls against the dead were better at patience than men raised to charge. Wounded went into a tent that had the flags of all the allies and none of the allies' pride. Sansa's letters arrived by riders who changed horses every 30 miles and had salt mixed into their water in pouches, so they could keep drinking without their bodies rebelling. When they lifted their faces and drank for the first time from the river south of the Blackwater, they laughed for the peculiar reason that the water didn't taste like snow. Inside the city, Qyburn played with death the way a scholar plays with ink. His fingers were stained that color, and it never washed out. He had scorpions raised on towers and on rooftops and on ox carts that moved along the streets like beetles with too many legs. He had men who knew how to load them and men who thought they knew. Arya made sure those men had hands that would shake. Tyrion went in under a flag that said parley and came out with a face that had learned not to say what it was thinking a dozen times over. Jaime Lannister came in at dawn with his hair cut like a penitent's and his sword at his hip like a habit he could not put aside. Brienne stood beside him in the evening with her hand on his wrist and a look on her face that promised she would break any oath required to keep the oaths that mattered. Cersei stood on a balcony and looked at the city and thought of Wildfire. Perhaps she always did. Bran watched her from the north as if watching the end of a story he already knew and had always disliked, and sent word to pull the people from the cellars with the green glass jars beneath them. The bells, that old, battered habit of mercy, rang before they should have. Daenerys, who had ridden a dragon into too many cities where nobody rang bells except priests calling men to prayer, kept Rhaegal high and watched the fleeing lines like the grains pouring through an hourglass. Drogon hovered beside her, and the air beat around them like a giant heart. "They will call you merciful if the city stands," Tyrion had said to her a day earlier. "But if you burn it, they will say you are mad, and the word will stick worse than oil. And all for the sake of a chair you could be sitting on with the doors open and men coming to you because they want to, not because they fear you." "I don't want their fear," she said, and the anger in her voice was the kind that does not raise itself because it knows its own strength. "I want them to stop taking." "They never will," he said. "But sometimes you can put enough good in a room that it becomes harder to be evil than to breathe. Let us try." The scorpions spat. Regal took one bolt in the shoulder and another along the ribs and kept flying, blood raining down in a sheet so thin it looked like a trick of sight. Drogon took none because a creature learns the hands that move against it and the angles they favor. The North's archers cut down the crews. The Dothraki swarmed in alleyways where horses could not gallop but men could still die in equal numbers. The city blew up in little breaths as caches of wildfire were found and tripped and quenched and sometimes not. The Red Keep stood like a tooth in a rotten mouth and refused to be pulled. They cut it out in rooms and stairs and windowsills and under an archway where Jaime Lannister killed a man and then looked at his hand as if he had been surprised to find it still there. Cersei was taken in a chamber with windows that looked on nothing she had not already burned with her eyes. She faced the queen under a dragon's shadow and the king in the North's hand. She held herself perfectly still, and if she feared, she did it like a woman who had decided long ago that she would not give fear the satisfaction of a tremor. She looked at Jon with contempt because contempt was easier than every other thing she had to feel. She looked at Daenerys with a hatred that had been honed into a blade and sharpened no end. She said nothing. "Words have done enough," Sansa wrote from Winterfell when they asked what should be done. "Let law finish." Tyrion stood with tears in his eyes that made his vision worse and said nothing else. Jaime came into the chamber in time to put his palm against his sister's cheek while the sentence was read. In the end, the queen who had never been a good mother to anything except her own fear died quickly, and men who had lost children because of her felt something in themselves give a little, like a thaw under a locked door. The war was over. The city stood. The smell of burned flesh was not everywhere. The bells did not ring again because there were too many people asleep in the streets. Daenerys sat in the throne room and did not sit the throne. She sat on the steps that led up to it and listened to men come to her to ask her to sit, and she shook her head once. "Not yet," she said. "Not until you come to me because you can and not because you must." A great council met in the dragon pit because once a place remembers what it is to hold dragons, it does not forget how to hold men. Lords and ladies and others who had never been able to afford a title stood under the open sky and learned that they had voices. The North came with 2 crowns, one for the man who had refused it and one for the boy who wore it without loving it. Sansa spoke like winter pleading for a clean spring. She made the case for a North that would govern its own and send its soldiers and its ships south not because it was told to but because it chose to. Yara Greyjoy spoke for the Ironborn in terms that were all salt and blood, and then surprised even herself by setting down a weapon she had never set down in her heart before. Davos spoke for the common men, and Brienne spoke for the ones who had sworn and sutured and stood. When it was done, the realm had a shape that was not the old one but did not break itself trying to be something wholly new. The North stood apart as it had been once, and the other kingdoms agreed they would remain under Daenerys Targaryen because the way she had not taken the throne had told them more about the way she would keep it than any seat could. There were grumbles. There were plots that fizzled wetly in the corners because there are always there. There was peace of a sort, the sort that allows childhoods to take root again. Jon stayed where he had always meant to. He sat in a chamber with maps that smelled of ink and lanolin and thought of roads in terms of days rather than miles. He rode the new gift and placed his hand on the shoulders of men who had once wanted to cut it off because they had misjudged him and now would have given him bread out of their own mouths. He took Ghost north of the wall and found that the land had learned to breathe again, even if it would always do so in long, slow breaths that made a man feel like he was sleeping with his eyes open. He stood at Eastwatch's broken edge and tasted salt and thought of Davos, who had a way of making men laugh out of the corner of their mouths just when they needed to. He sat in the Godswood and spoke to his brother of small things and found that those were the ones that took. Bran listened and sometimes smiled and sometimes did not. Time had a different shape for him, and Jon learned to accept it without trying to carve it back into a circle a man could walk around with his feet. Sansa sat with them often, her hands quiet on her lap when they were still and cutting through air when they were not. Arya came and went like a day that a man can't quite remember if it was winter or summer. Once, when the thaw had begun and water trickled under packed snow in a sound like distant laughter, Jon asked Bran whether he regretted a thing. "There is no getting back to a road you did not take," Bran said. "You can only see where it went. Sometimes I look, because I can't help it. Sometimes I don't, because I must help how I am to be." Jon let his head rest back against the tree and closed his eyes. "I used to think life would turn into something I recognized, like a battle that ended or a hearth that stayed lit. But it's only ever been the next step and the next." "That's what lives do," Bran said. "They go. That's what kingships do. They keep a way open." Daenerys came north once when the first green showed in the glass gardens. She went among the children as if they were a kind of treasure and taught a boy with hair like wet straw to say her name without the stumble that turned one of its syllables into a cough. She sat with Sansa and learned how many pies a city needs to avoid riots simply because people feel cheated when other people get food they don't. She walked the walls and watched the northern sunset light a sky she had never seen before, and then admitted to Jon, in a voice without a queen in it, that this place made her afraid. "Of what?" he asked softly. "Of liking it too much," she said. "Of liking the way the light looks on stone. Of doing something I shouldn't to keep it. We all learn not to hold too hard," he said, and looked down at his hand where the healed places were paler than the rest. "Sometimes." She went south the next day, and the stain of her laughter, that small, rare sound, remained for a time in the way men spoke to each other along the battlements. Years did what years do. They added space between faces you miss and the next time you see them. They trimmed the sharpness of a pain without stealing its shape. They taught men the names of their children and then taught them how to forget their own when fear rose again. The North stood, taller in some places and broken in others, and stitched always by hands that did not let the cloth fray without so much as a needle shoved through in time. When the first summer swallows came back and sketched their fast loops above the pool in the Godswood, Jon sat with his back to the heart tree and let himself be warm. Ghost sprawled with his ribs up like a fisherman on a dock. Bran had his eyes half closed, which meant he was somewhere between this place and 1,000 others. "Do you still hear the crows?" Jon asked. "All the time," Bran said. "But I choose when to speak back." "What do they say?" "They say what they always have." Bran's voice had deepened with the years in a way that made it sound as if it had gained another voice inside it. "They say that there is death in the world and there is life, and the more you feed one, the less the other goes hungry. They say the trees remember. They say the water keeps secrets and tells them to anyone with patience." "And what do you say?" Bran opened his eyes fully and turned to look at him. For a heartbeat, he looked like the boy who had toddled after their older brothers with a grin that had not yet broken a tooth. "I say we are doing what we can," he said. "I say that when men tell a story about this time, it will not need to be truer than memory to be worth the telling." He smiled briefly and beautifully. "I say that a man can wear the shape of a throne without letting it make his bones into its shape." Jon chuckled, and this time the sound came out without any break in it for grief to catch at. "You speak like a king." "I have had practice," Bran said. The swallows wrote their bright lines over the pool. Somewhere in the keep a child shouted and then laughed, and the waves of that laughter broke along the stones and washed any bitterness from them that might have been gathering there. A girl's voice rose in reply and then broke into song without remembering it had, and a boy's voice joined it. On the wall, a guard who had once trembled with hunger now trembled only when he was telling a story to make the off-watch laugh. In the yard, a woman went from arm to cistern and called to her sister for more water, and in her voice joy sat down as if it had bought itself the right to be there. Jon leaned his head back against the tree and let his eyes close for a breath. Not to pray this time, to listen. The sound of the north entered him. Onion skin crackle of new leaves, leather sigh on stone, the specific rattle of a wheel that needed oil and would get it by dusk. He heard Bran's breath. He heard Ghost's sigh, a sound so big for a thing so quiet that it made Jon smile. He heard his own heart, steady and unastonished, and under it another beat that had been there longer than his body, a beat that belonged to the land and the line of wolves that had chosen to stay in it. When a man chooses his path early and then chooses it again with every step after, others will call him patient, and some will call him stubborn, and a few will call him lucky. Jon Snow did not name himself any of those things. He rose when it was time to rise, and when the next messenger came into the yard with the next need, he listened and answered. When the sun went down, he stood on the wall and started to say a prayer, and then realized he no longer had to ask for anything. He was doing it. He looked south where the air had a different color and wondered how many people were breathing easier tonight because of the choices made here. And when the number did not come to him, he smiled and decided that numbers are for markets, and good lives for the counting of the fortunate. He went back through the gate to the warmth of the stone and the smell of stew and the touch of a hand on his arm. He took off the wolf's fang brooch that the smith had carved from weirwood as a joke and a vow when he had first become the king's hand, and set it on the table. He slept and dreamed of nothing. In the morning he woke to snow and sunlight and a raven's call that did not demand a thing from him beyond what he had already chosen freely. The north kept its promises. The south kept its better dreams. Dragons moved through the skies so rarely that old men could make children listen by saying they had seen one once. Sansa's hair went silver first at the temples, then in a streak that made her look more fierce than age should. Arya came home once with a map that had been drawn in a place where the maps are much worse than the journeys, and she stayed long enough to help a boy remember where to put the point of his knife when he needed to, and then kissed the top of her brother's head in the Godswood as if she were touching the past, and told him she loved him in a voice that did not need to say it again for a decade. Bran looked at the trees and the crows and the people and the heart that beat through them and held the crown like a ring that keeps a finger from breaking. Jon grew old as a man grows who has lived vigorously and quietly at once, each day taking its portion of him and giving him back more than it took. And when at last it came time to lie down for longer than a night, he went to the Godswood and leaned his head against the tree like a boy who had found his father there, and he let himself breathe out into a world that had relearned how to breathe. Ghost lay at his feet, muzzle on his boots, the snow not yet sticking to his fur. Bran was there and Sansa, and the wind moved through the branches with that soft scraping that had once been the only voice Jon trusted. The North has a way of promising nothing and giving everything. Jon had learned to hear the promise even when it said no word, and he had kept his end of it in the only way that matters, by living so that others could. The heart tree's face watched without blinking while he slept, and the snow fell in flakes that cut the air like blades without drawing blood. On the wall, a guard told a story that was almost true. In the yard, a child laughed. In the capital, a queen signed a charter that had the smell of bread baked that morning. The crows spoke nonsense and wisdom. The dragons dreamed. The dead remained dead. The North kept its king and his hand as a pair of truths it had needed for a very long time. And summer, such as the world had to give, came across the stones like a small, shy animal and lay down there for a while with its head on its paws, and men had the sense at last to let it rest.